Imagine a time when the most powerful medium was painting. Imagine that suddenly a new way of thinking and behaving completely changed the way we pictured the world. Between 1200 and 1350, in a small area of central Italy, the world changed forever. 800 years after the collapse of the Roman Empire, Europe's dark ages were coming to an end. New ideas and opportunities were taking life in new directions. Cities, commerce, the visual arts, religion, and our understanding of ourselves would never be the same. This was the dawn of the Renaissance, the first light of the modern Western world. It was a time when visual images were becoming increasingly important. About 200 years before the printing press, at a time when few could read, pictures were a powerful way of communicating with thousands of people. For hundreds of years, painting and mosaic decoration had shown a world like this. Rich backgrounds, flat bodies, front-facing poses, and dignified, emotionally distant figures were standard. Movement and three-dimensionality are excluded from these solemn depictions of stately, heavenly subjects. In the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine had moved the capital of the Roman Empire to Byzantium, or Istanbul as we know it today, and he declared Christianity the state religion. The Byzantine style, influenced by Eastern artistic traditions, dominated the empire's new churches and became the official face of Christianity. But change was on the horizon. An impoverished friar, an unlikely visionary, was about to introduce a new way of thinking about ourselves physically and spiritually. He changed the way we see the world.
Between the end of the 12th century, the late 1100s, and the mid-1300s, a fundamental change took place in Western man's vision of himself. It took place in the context of the rapid growth of cities. It took place in the context of an extraordinary development of industry and therefore of personal and corporate and civic wealth. It took place, though, not in the form of a philosophy, of a system of thought. It took place specifically within religious practice. This change in Western man's understanding of his individuality, of his emotions, of his life took place as a new spirituality and is due above all to one man, St. Francis of Assisi.
Here at the Basilica of San Francesco in Assisi, we can see the effect St. Francis had on how people began to think of themselves, the world around them, God, and the revolutionary change that thinking inspired in painting. Francis Bernardone was born in Assisi in 1182. He came from the newly thriving middle class. His father was a cloth merchant who traded with France. His mother was French. He was a man of the city, cosmopolitan, literate, and enjoying the pleasures of being young and wealthy.
Francis was a bit wild and crazy in his youth, too. He was the kind of a party animal, as we'd say these days. There's questions as to how crazy he was, but he admits readily that he was a sinful person, that he did things that he's not proud of later in his life, and that he repented of and that he remorsed over later in his life. So you can see certain values in a personality. You can see their problems too and their limitations, but you cannot. There's a certain part of the personality that beams out, even in people who are struggling. There's a kind of a beauty in them. There was something outstanding in his personality that even in his brokenness, people would say, that guy's going to be special. That guy's going to be important.
Francis' carefree youth ended when he was taken prisoner in a war between Assisi and Perugia. After about a year in captivity, he returned to Assisi a changed man. He was determined to live his life with Christ as his daily example, his goodness, his love, his charity, and his poverty. This image in Assisi, a fresco painted directly onto wet plaster in the 1280s, shows the young Francis giving his cloak to a poor man. To visitors today, it still communicates its message about the importance of charity.
Francis was instinctively dramatic, even theatrical. He spontaneously translated his deep feelings into actions that could communicate them, that made their meaning evident. When he wanted to divest himself of his father's wealth, he didn't go to a notary and sign a document. He took off his clothes in the public square to express to everyone that he would no longer be clothed by an earthly father, but only by the God who had made him.
For Francis, and for the thousands of friars who came to follow him, faith was not intellectual. It was about experience, action, the good of the community, and deeply felt emotion. His identification with the joys and suffering of Christ was physical, was personal. Francis was so intensely moved by the suffering of Christ that he wept constantly, so much so that he risked blindness. His deeply emotive approach to faith was revolutionary. It gave Christianity a new emotional and psychological depth in which communication, spreading the word of God's love, became key. As well as having an instinctive sense of drama, Francis could communicate with the written word at a time when few were literate. He was a poet. His Canticle of Brother Sun is the very first work of literature in Italian. The formal language of business, the church, and high culture was Latin, but it was not his choice for his simple, accessible message.
St. Francis' love of nature and his deep need to communicate that love to others did take literary form in at least one work which has entered the history of Italian and European literature, where Francis expresses his love of the natural world by praising the God who has created, and then he lists the different parts of nature that have deeply touched him and drawn him. Let me read the first lines and then a few other bits and pieces to give you a sense of how he approaches it. He starts out as a prayer. Altissimo onnipotente bon Signore, tue sono le
Praised
lodi.
be you, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially Sir Brother Sun, who is the day through whom you give us light. And he is beautiful, and radiant with great splendor. Of you, Most High, he bears the likeness. Praised be you, my Lord, through Sister Moon and the stars in the heavens. You have made them bright, precious, and fair. Praised be you, my Lord, through brothers wind and air, and fair and stormy, all weathers, moods, by which you cherish all that you have made.
And finally, Laudato si mi Signore per sola nostra morte corporale. Praised be you, my Lord, for our sister death, from which no man can escape. And indeed that was true for Francis, as it is for all of us.
The most influential of St. Francis' writings is the code by which the friars who followed him were to live. It begins, "The rule of the life of the friars minor is this, namely to observe the holy gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ by living in obedience, without anything of one's own, and in chastity."
Monastic orders at the time had, huge books, volumes of all kinds of rules and laws and regulations that all the monks would do and follow, and they would follow everything that was very detailed. Francis comes with this simple rule, which has maybe 14 points in it, that says, well, the friars, will be poor, the friars will be this. And it was not specifying every mode of action or everything they would do, but rather the spirit of how the Franciscans would live. At first there was some kind of concern, well, you guys are kind of pretty casual about this. But with time they saw the wisdom of it, because in a sense, it's a very malleable rule, not that we compromise the spirit of the rule, but that we can adjust it from age to age.
While other points of the rule may be interpreted and adapted, Francis' simple rules of poverty, chastity, and obedience have remained constant. They have become the basic vows of all Catholic clergy. As debate about the celibacy of the priesthood continues today, the rule of St. Francis remains controversial more than 800 years after it was written. As important as his writings are, the story of St. Francis' life has proved an even greater source of inspiration and influence. His emotional approach to Christianity and his belief that God's love was so clearly found in nature revolutionized Christian spirituality and the visual arts, especially painting. St. Francis is both the subject and the influence that moves painting from here to here. From the stiff, flat formality of Byzantine images to a living, three-dimensional world full of action and emotion.
We're standing in a chapel in the Franciscan church in Florence, in a chapel built by a wealthy banking family, the Bardi family. A chapel decorated in the early 14th century by the most famous artist in the new style, the style directly influenced by the spirituality of St. Francis and his followers, the Franciscans. The artist is Giotto, and here at my right you have perhaps one of his most famous frescoes, a fresco in which the full richness of the new Western, typically Franciscan vision of humanity is evident. It is the fresco that depicts the death of St. Francis, and Francis, as he lies on his deathbed, is accompanied by members of the Franciscan order, some of them robed already for a funeral ceremony, others there in a more personal way to be with their beloved teacher and master as he dies, one who kisses his hand. There's even an emissary from the Pope sent to verify the account that Francis had received the wounds of Christ's passion. And this crimson-robed gentleman whom we see from behind is putting his hand into the wound in Francis' side, corresponding to the wound in Christ's side. And that perhaps is really the easiest way to sum up the entirely new vision of man that Francis had helped usher in. It has to do with the body. Giotto, in fact, is a great master in the depiction of the body. As we look at this fresco, we're extremely conscious of the powerful three-dimensionality of these rather unmoving, these rather stiff, but nonetheless well-modeled, fully packed bodies. And Giotto uses the body as a vehicle for the expression of drama and of dramatic emotions. As we look at the faces of the friars who are present for the death of St. Francis, we see an extraordinary range of human feeling. Some who are simply there for the funeral service and who look serious, who look grave, but are not personally involved. Others, however, who are personally involved in a variety of ways, almost all of them of extraordinary intensity. One who, with an ancient gesture of grief, raises his hands as if in shock and deep sorrow. Another, a young friar, who, bending his head, gives Giotto the chance to show how skilled he is in the modeling of a foreshortened, bent head. But the friar bends his head to gently kiss the stigmatized hand of St. Francis.
Here in San Francesco, there are several depictions of St. Francis and the miracle of the stigmata. In 1224, while praying in the mountains, a six-winged angel, a seraphim, appeared to St. Francis in a blaze of light. When the vision faded, he saw that his hands, feet, and side had been miraculously pierced with the same wounds Christ had received on the cross. These were the stigmata, and Francis was the first saint to receive them. The divinely inflicted wounds were seen as a sign from God that he had lived in perfect imitation of Christ.
Francis knew spirituality, like the very stigmata which he received, the wounds of Christ present in his hands and feet and side, had to do with the body as the meaningful vehicle of deep religious feeling, but the religious feeling is itself even more deeply human. And this is, we can say, profoundly true to the basic central idea of Christianity, which is that God became a true man in Jesus Christ. True God was present truly in human flesh. He lived as a man, he worked as a man, he had friends, he wept for the death of his friend Lazarus, he died with terrible suffering, he rose from the dead. Francis, because of the stigmata and because of the intensely human way in which he lived the Christian message, was by his contemporaries considered another Christ, alter Christus.
A living example of Christ and a charismatic leader, St. Francis was also a fragile human being. Bleeding from the stigmata, worn out by fasting, nearly blind, Francis passed from this world to the next, having established one of the most powerful and successful orders in the Catholic Church. In 1210, he had 12 followers. By 1226, there were more than 10,000 Franciscans, and the order continued to grow. Their missionary work took them to France, Germany, Spain, and the Holy Land. Francis himself traveled to Egypt. By the mid-13th century, the Franciscans had reached China. This upstart order, with its growing popularity and devotion to poverty, was a challenge to the Church. In the 13th century, the Roman Catholic Church was the Western world's predominant superpower, the richest and most politically powerful institution in Europe. Avoiding internal struggles between factions was essential. To cement good relations with the Franciscans, Pope Gregory IX moved quickly to declare Francis a saint. he traveled to Assisi to officiate at the canonization of St. Francis, and on July 18, 1228, Pope Gregory himself laid the foundation stone of this building. The Basilica of San Francesco in Assisi is a massive exercise in public relations. It sent an unmistakable message that the Catholic Church embraced the Franciscan order and revered its founder. The meaning of an image like this would have been clear to people of that time. It would tell them that St. Francis was literally a pillar of the Church. It rests on his strength.
Francis is seen holding up a church, and the Pope is sleeping. Actually, the Pope is having a dream of Francis holding up this church. The history in that is that the day before, Francis came to visit the Pope with his group dressed like ragamuffins and asking for some kind of a blessing from this Pope. He doesn't know who they are. There's been a lot of problems with other groups like this who've come to see him and ask for their blessing and then turn around and, cause problems. So he's not really sure. So he kind of says, well, wait, I have to think about this, and invites him to come back the next day. Meanwhile, the Pope has this dream. And he dreams of this same guy that had seen him that day, but now he's holding up St. John Lateran, which is the mother church of the Roman Catholic Church. The Pope, in this dream, was convinced then this has to happen, that this is the man, in a sense, who's going to bring some renewal into the church. And so he gives the blessing to the first group of friars that come to visit him.
It is one of the ironies of history that no expense was spared on this monument to the poorest and most humble of saints. The solid, conservative exterior of the Basilica of San Francesco gives no hint of the richness inside. This is the birthplace of a new art. Known as the St. Francis legend, this series of 28 scenes is a huge picture book telling the story of the saint's life. It is one of the world's most important works of art and has influenced more than 40 generations of artists. Here, for the first time since the Roman Empire more than 800 years before, artists strove to depict reality. Francis saw the greatness of God in nature and made an emotional connection to his followers and to Christ. The painters who worked on San Francesco show us the natural world Francis loved and the emotions he encouraged us to feel. Under his influence, here in Assisi, naturalism, truth to appearances, becomes the ultimate goal of painting. Right into the late 19th century, naturalism remains one of art's primary objectives. As to who painted these scenes in the 1280s and 90s, there is continuing debate. Timothy Verdon is among those who believe they are by the greatest early master of the new naturalism.
There's much discussion about who physically painted the frescoes in Assisi, but today the pendulum has swung back to accepting the old sources that say Giotto did it all. He didn't do it all, but he must have been one of the directing minds and hands. But what that would mean is that he spent several years early in his career close to the Franciscans. I mean, they didn't just, open the church in the morning and let him in. They told him about, he took part in their services. He could have been a member of the Franciscan Third Order. In any case, it's no accident that he's called here to the biggest Franciscan church to paint these frescoes. The Franciscans already know him, they trust him. I think Giotto's inner life had been to a good degree shaped by the experience of Franciscan spirituality and Franciscan life. And they must have believed that. They seem to have trusted him to do these things. So you're really looking at a Franciscan painter.
The major features of painting that will be fully developed in the Renaissance 200 years later are all found first in San Francesco, in works by Giotto. The realistic representation of scale, a sense of a three-dimensional world with rounded bodies and depth of space. The use of contemporary settings and architecture. The depiction not only of events, but of what people were thinking and feeling. St. Francis preaching to the birds is one of the most popular subjects for religious art. The story comes from a book called The Little Flowers of St. Francis, written from the recollections of friars who had known him. While traveling to a small town near Assisi, Francis saw a flock of birds and was moved to preach to them. My little sisters the birds, ye owe much to God your Creator, and ye ought to sing his praises at all times and in all places, because he has given you liberty to fly about. And though ye neither spin nor sew, he has given you clothing for yourselves and for your offspring. He feeds you, though ye neither sow nor reap. He has given you fountains and rivers to quench your thirst, mountains and valleys in which to take refuge, and trees in which to build your nests. Beware, my little sisters, of the sin of ingratitude, and study always to give praise to God. Three versions of the Sermon to the Birds show how much painting changed over a period of about 50 years. The advance in the realistic depiction of scale and three-dimensional space is striking. Here in San Francesco, this version, painted in 1235, shows Francis and the tree beside him as roughly the same size. In the Bardi Chapel in Florence, in this version in the Byzantine style from 1240, the birds are flat and arranged like books on shelves. Here in San Francesco again, in the version of the story in the St. Francis legend painted in the 1280s, Francis and the tree are in proportion, and a bird swoops through space toward him. Of all the scenes in the St. Francis legend at San Francesco in Assisi, this one, the miracle at Greccio, most dramatically unites St. Francis' innovative approach to spirituality with equally innovative developments in art.
Francis deeply felt things. He wanted others to share his deep feelings. At Greccio, the basic internal mechanism seems to have been his dismay when he perceived that the people of Greccio didn't deeply feel what Christmas was about, didn't feel it the way he did. And so he basically asks himself, how can I make them feel the things that I feel?
He tried to make Jesus accessible to everybody. We know the story of the nativity of Jesus. Well, the way it's explained and understood now is that we have these little statues of Joseph and Mary and the little baby Jesus and the animals in the background and that. Well, Francis started that about 800 years ago by getting some real live people, brought the animals into this place, invited the local town people to come. And it was at Christmas time, so he said, come on, we're going to celebrate Christmas in a special way. So before their very eyes, they see infleshed, incarnated, what happened so many years before, 1,200 years before, when Jesus, the God-man, came to be with us. And it kind of just made things so much more visceral, much more tangible for the people. They said, wow, he's not just a God way up there, but in fact, he's really close to us. And he's just this little baby that I could hold in my arms.
As Francis had made Christ accessible to the people, the artists of the St. Francis legend strove to make the story of the saint's life as accessible, clear, and moving as they could. And they broke new ground to do it.
What the painter has done here is quite